Matthew 14:22 through 33. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land. Buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they cried. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Peter's faith gave him the strength to get out of that boat and walk on the water until the wind came. The physical act of walking on the water straight to Jesus, who was standing on the water in front of him, held his faith firm. But he allowed the harsh wind to shake his faith and cause him to sink. Peter had a crisis of faith. The storm in his life was a physical wind that scared him, and his fear and loss of faith caused him to sink. In all of our lives, there will come a storm. It's inevitable. And you may not be prepared when it comes. And just like Peter, we may find ourselves at a crisis in our faith. A crisis of faith is a time, and I believe this will happen in every Christian's life, when something happens and you have a choice to make. Maybe your one person who has always been there for you dies, and you have no idea how you are going to get through the overwhelming grief. It feels like your heart has broken, and God should have protected you. He should have kept your horrible, horrible problem from happening, especially if you've done your best to faithfully serve him. It's in that moment of utter despair and anguish, at that exact moment of crisis, that you have a choice to make. You can also suffer a crisis of faith when you get fired from a job unexpectedly. Maybe you make a devastating financial decision that you think will destroy you. Maybe you find out your spouse has been unfaithful, or you get a diagnosis that could end your life, or someone close to you gets a devastating diagnosis. A crisis of faith is any situation that causes you such stress and anguish that you find yourself questioning God's love, God's faithfulness, and even God's existence. Peter was doing the impossible when his Savior came to him on the water. But in a moment, his entire reality was focused on the harsh winds that blew. He had physical, concrete proof of being able to do the impossible because he was doing it with Jesus. but he still lost his faith. What I find especially interesting in this set of scriptures, in Matthew 16:18, when it says, "And I say also unto thee, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." That this set of scriptures comes after Peter lost his faith and sank in the water. I had a crisis of faith that almost sunk me. All I wanted to do was lay down on the cold tile floor and die. I was not being dramatic and foolish. I was not overreacting. My circumstances were overwhelming. It was too much for me, and I did not understand. In that crisis, dying seemed like the only option. I am talking about the death spiritually, which I believe many Christians choose to do when they face their own crisis of faith. This is why so many people are angry with God. God gets the blame for all that goes wrong in our lives because he could have, he should have never let it happen. And the enemy wins every single time we allow ourselves to die spiritually. I was at that point, but God granted me just enough strength to reach out my hand to him and cry out, "Lord, save me," just like Peter. And just like Peter, I feel like I climbed into the life-saving boat and started to worship the one who saved me. When you face your crisis of faith, are you going to take the easy road of dying spiritually? Are you going to allow yourself to be entitled to lay there and suffer and eventually get blown over by the storm that you never saw coming? Are you going to choose selfish means of supposed healing by seeking to satisfy your flesh because your spirit is in such anguish? Are you going to medicate your hurt away, then keep medicating it with more and more medication until you don't care about anything or anyone and you make decisions that are the absolute worst for you? Are you going to allow anger at your situation to fill you with hate and resentment until you no longer recognize the person staring back at you in the mirror? Have you already had your crisis of faith and you chose all that I just mentioned? You chose to die spiritually rather than to reach your hand out and cry, "Lord, save me." I want to remind you that it's never too late to be like Peter and cry out to God to save you every minute of every day until that gaping wound that almost killed you heals. And once that wound heals, will you proudly display the scar for the world to see what God brought you through? Because here is the very truth of the situation. Once you go through something that causes you to have a crisis of faith, you are never the same as you were before. It's your choice if you're going to allow that situation to make you a broken shell of a person you once were, or to become a warrior who overcame the impossible and has the battle scars to prove it. May you find strength in the midst of your storm.